It started like any other Tuesday morning at River Oaks Middle School, just outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The school bell rang at 8:15 sharp. Students filed into their classrooms, and Ms. Denise Whittaker, a sixth-grade language arts teacher with 18 years under her belt, began her lesson on persuasive writing. But what happened before the second period ended would spiral into something that no one, least of all the school board, saw coming. What do you think of the beginning? The intrigue is already there. A young girl silenced, a father who won't back down. What happens next? I'm already wondering where this will lead. Follow us for more powerful stories like this. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Come back tomorrow for a new surprise on our channel. 12-year-old Malia Jefferson, a bright, inquisitive, and admittedly talkative student, raised her hand for the third time in 10 minutes. She'd always been eager. Too eager, some teachers whispered in the break room, and too black for some, others muttered when no one was listening. Malia's father, Darius Jefferson, always told her, "Use your voice, baby. That's your weapon. That's your light." He knew something about voices. He was one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in the South. But Ms. Whittaker wasn't interested in Malia's voice that day. After a brief exchange where Malia insisted she wasn't talking out of turn, Whittaker snapped. She walked over to the girl's desk, pulled a roll of clear packing tape from her drawer, why it was there, no one knew, and pressed a strip across Malia's mouth. Not jokingly, not lightly, firmly, deliberately, silenced. The class froze. Some students laughed nervously, unsure of what to do. Others took out their phones. One student, Jordan Ellis, secretly recorded it. That video would later rip through social media like a lit match in a dry forest. When Malia got home and pulled the tape out of her backpack to show her father, Darius Jefferson didn't say a word. He just stared at it, his jaw clenching so hard it looked like it might shatter. By that night, he'd filed a formal complaint against the school, the district, and personally named Ms. Whittaker. By the next morning, he'd filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. What started as an incident confined to one Louisiana classroom erupted into a national firestorm. The school went on lockdown after protests broke out at the front gates. Reporters crowded the parking lot. The principal, who initially claimed it was an unfortunate misunderstanding, was forced to resign within 72 hours. But that was only the beginning. Darius didn't just want an apology. He didn't want a settlement check. He wanted the truth. And what he found stunned even him. In the course of discovery for the lawsuit, he gained access to internal emails between faculty. One thread, dated only a month before the incident, included a teacher referring to Malia as a little courtroom in training and joking, "Too bad we can't hit mute on her." Another email revealed complaints about students who don't know their place, with a list exclusively including black students. But the real bombshell came when Jefferson uncovered an audio recording, taken secretly by a substitute teacher who had long been suspicious of what he called coded racism among staff. In the recording, Whittaker is heard saying, "These kids need to be put in their place. They're not in some courtroom. They're daddies. Don't scare me." The case took a darker turn when it was discovered that Ms. Whittaker had been the subject of two previous complaints, one in 2019, one in 2021, for allegedly singling out black students for discipline. Both had been quietly dismissed by the school board. But perhaps the most unexpected twist came when a former teacher at River Oaks, now living in Atlanta, contacted Jefferson anonymously. She said she'd left the school after she was pressured to ignore racially biased behavior among staff. She had kept records, names, dates, incidents, all of it. Jefferson now had a civil rights case that was quickly becoming a landmark lawsuit. The Department of Justice requested access. The NAACP offered public support. And for the first time in nearly a decade, the Baton Rouge School Board was forced to publicly reckon with systemic racism inside its own walls. But even as the media stormed every corner of the story, no one expected what came next, when Whittaker, under pressure and in deposition, admitted that she had not acted alone. She said, "It was part of a behavioral management strategy we were trained to use with certain students." Certain students. Jefferson leaned forward in his chair during that deposition, eyes locked on hers. "By certain," he asked slowly, "you mean black?" Whittaker didn't answer. She didn't need to. By the end of that week, the video of Malia sitting with tape across her mouth had reached over 3 million views. Morning shows wanted interviews. Community leaders demanded resignations. But while the public raged at Ms. Whittaker, Darius Jefferson kept his focus on what lay beneath. The word strategy kept echoing in his head. Whittaker claimed she'd been trained to handle students like Malia with stricter, non-verbal disciplinary tools. Jefferson wasn't buying the euphemism. He filed a motion to subpoena training documents, professional development logs, and any memos circulated by the district's behavior management team over the last 5 years. At first, the school district refused. They tried stalling, citing privacy. Then they claimed the files could not be located. But Jefferson had dealt with this kind of stonewalling before. He pushed harder and quietly reached out to a contact in the State Department of Education. Within days, he got what he needed, a leaked copy of the internal classroom behavioral compliance protocol used by several teachers in the district. It was a 24-page document. On the surface, it looked harmless. Standard procedures, techniques for de-escalation, flowcharts of behavior paths. But hidden in the language were quiet horrors. Page 16, Section 3.5. For students who exhibit excessive verbal disruption, particularly from households where formal discipline structures may be lacking, silent compliance tools are permissible at staff discretion. Jefferson's team did a demographic breakdown. 94% of the students labeled excessive verbal disruptors were black. The protocol had never been officially approved by the school board. It was created internally, passed around among teachers like a playbook, its real authorship buried behind layers of departmental sign-offs. Then another shoe dropped. A whistleblower came forward, a former district administrator named Rebecca Kilburn. She had retired quietly just 6 months earlier, but said the guilt of what she'd seen was rotting her from the inside. In a recorded statement, she revealed that not only was the compliance protocol widely used, it had been encouraged during off-the-books teacher workshops. And those workshops were led by someone Jefferson had seen before, Dr. Leonard McCrae, the district's director of student development. Dr. McCrae was a charismatic former college professor known for his tough love stance on student behavior. He'd been praised by local media for raising test scores and reducing suspensions. But according to Kilburn, He had also privately championed a system that labeled black students as volatile communicators and non-compliant by nature. McCrae denied it at first, until Jefferson's legal team found a damning slide deck in an archived Google Drive. One slide read, "In many urban homes, verbal dominance equals respect. In our classrooms, this must be reversed." That sentence was enough to explode the case into a national scandal. CNN, MSNB, Fox, everyone covered it. Pundits battled on TV. Civil rights groups flooded Baton Rouge. And in the middle of the storm stood Darius Jefferson, a father who'd once simply wanted his daughter to love learning, and now found himself at the center of a modern-day reckoning. The Department of Justice launched a formal inquiry into not just River Oaks Middle School, but the entire Ascension Parish School District. Several teachers resigned quietly. Others lawyered up. And then, another twist. 3 more families came forward. Black girls, all under the age of 13. Each one had experienced a similar incident. Tape over the mouth. But none of them had spoken up. They thought it was just how teachers handled kids like us. As one girl put it, Malia wasn't the first. She was just the first whose father had the power and the will to fight back. The courtroom was packed, not with strangers, but with neighbors, church elders, teachers, students, civil rights activists, national reporters, and at least 3 camera crews that had set up across the street. It wasn't just Jefferson V's Ascension Parish School District anymore. This was America on trial. Inside, Darius Jefferson stood across from the school district's legal team, a group flown in from a high-powered New Orleans firm. They'd come armed with folders, data, and carefully worded denials. But Jefferson had something stronger, truth, and something even more dangerous to those who feared exposure: receipts. Malia sat quietly behind her father, holding her mother's hand. She was dressed in navy blue and white, her hair in long braids, her expression stoic. She hadn't cried since that first night. She didn't plan to today. When Jefferson stood to deliver his opening argument, he didn't start with legal jargon. He didn't talk about Title VI violations or Section 1983 claims. He talked about his daughter. "My child walked into a classroom eager to learn and walked out silenced, not just by tape, but by a system that decided her voice was too loud, too black, and too much of a problem." The jury was silent. Even the defense attorney looked up from her notes. Jefferson then laid it all out: the protocol, the secret workshops, the demographic data, the leaked slides. And finally, he played a clip of Malia herself, recorded just a few days after the incident, sitting at her kitchen table with her tiny hands in her lap. "I don't know why she did it," Malia said in the video. "I was just answering the question. I didn't yell. I thought we were allowed to talk in class." The video cut. People in the courtroom audibly exhaled. One juror wiped away a tear. But the defense wasn't done. They brought in expert witnesses, behavioral consultants, and even a former black teacher from the district who claimed, "Sometimes structure is misunderstood as oppression." Jefferson let them talk. He knew the moment that would break the case hadn't arrived yet. It came during cross-examination. One of the district's key witnesses was Dr. Leonard McCrae himself. Sharp suit, calm voice. He leaned into the microphone like he'd done this before. "There was no racially motivated agenda," he said. "Our goal has always been academic success and classroom order." Jefferson nodded. Then he pulled out a paper. "Dr. McCrae, do you recognize this?" "Yes, that's a schedule of our voluntary development sessions." And were you present during the March 18th session? Yes, I led that one. Can you read the title of that session, please? McCrae hesitated. Then stiffly, Discipline and Dominance, Rethinking Urban Classroom Dynamics. There it was. Jefferson walked to the evidence table, held up a printed slide. It was the one the media hadn't seen yet, the one he'd been saving. Please read this quote from your slide. I don't have my glasses. That's fine. I'll read it for you. He turned to the jury. Certain children must understand that in a civilized society, authority outweighs voice. If they will not submit, they must be retrained to do so. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jefferson leaned in close. And in your notes, Dr. McCrae, under certain children, you listed low-income, single-parent, urban African-American females. The defense attorney jumped up with an objection, but the judge let it stand. The damage was done. The trial became a national referendum. A former state superintendent was forced to resign. A board member stepped down after journalists uncovered her racist text messages mocking the case. River Oaks Middle School shut down temporarily after student walkouts. And 3 more lawsuits were filed by families who had long been ignored, one involving a student with a learning disability who'd also been taped, but never believed. Then came the jury verdict. The courtroom was silent when the foreperson stood. We find in favor of the plaintiff and award punitive damages in the amount of $12 million. Cheers erupted. Tears. Applause. Jefferson didn't smile. He just turned to Malia and said, You see? Your voice mattered. But the story didn't end there. 1 year later, the Jeffersons used a portion of the settlement to start the Malia Foundation, offering legal defense funds to families fighting school discrimination. Jefferson partnered with HBCUS to launch a pipeline of future civil rights attorneys. But the biggest twist? Ms. Whittaker, after initially going silent, agreed to a public interview with 60 Minutes. And in that interview, she said something no one expected. I was wrong, but I wasn't the architect of this system. I was raised in it, trained by it, rewarded by it. They'll replace me, but the machine stays unless someone burns it down. And when asked what changed her perspective, she paused. I saw the tape of Malia looking into that camera asking why, and I realized I didn't have an answer that wouldn't damn me. It had been 14 months since that courtroom verdict shook Baton Rouge and the country. The headlines had moved on. The media frenzy had quieted. But the ripple effects of Malia Jefferson's silencing were still moving through American schools like a slow, unstoppable wave. The Malia Foundation grew quickly. What started as a local support network became a national alliance of attorneys, educators, and activists. Within a year, it had reviewed 143 cases of school-based racial misconduct. 36 were deemed actionable. 6 school districts settled without trial. Malia, now 13, became the face of something bigger than anyone imagined. She spoke at conferences, testified in front of Louisiana's state legislature, and was even invited to a panel hosted by Michelle Obama's foundation. In one clip that went viral, she said, "They tried to tape my mouth shut, but they ended up giving me a microphone." Her words became a slogan printed on T-shirts, murals, even pinned to bulletin boards in classrooms that had once discouraged students from disruptive expression. But behind the scenes, another story was unfolding, one even Darius Jefferson didn't see coming. It arrived quietly, no return address, handwritten, postmarked from Jackson, Mississippi. It was from a teacher, anonymous, who claimed that a similar compliance protocol had been used not only in Louisiana, but also in 3 other southern states. She attached photocopies of worksheets and training emails nearly identical to the ones Jefferson had uncovered in Baton Rouge. That triggered a new wave of investigation. Jefferson sent private investigators, requested FOIA documents, and interviewed over 20 educators off the record. A network began to emerge, an informal yet widespread collection of school leaders who had quietly shared techniques through private online forums, annual discipline retreats, and whispered word-of-mouth mentorships. What bound them together? A common belief that black children, especially girls, were louder, more defiant, and required a different kind of control. Jefferson called it what it was, a conspiracy of silence. He brought the evidence to the DOJ. A new federal probe opened, one with teeth this time. And while the government moved slowly, another surprise came from within the Louisiana state legislature. The Malia Act, drafted with bipartisan support after mounting pressure from activists and voters, the Malia Student Protection Act, sought to do something no other state had dared. 1. Ban all physical compliance tools like tape, desk restraints, and forced isolation without formal review. 2nd, mandate third-party observers for classrooms with repeated disciplinary complaints. 3, and most controversially, require annual racial bias training for all public school educators, with failure to complete resulting in license suspension. The bill passed, narrowly, but it passed. And on the day it did, Malia stood on the Capitol steps, flanked by her mother and father, holding the signed document in her hands. She was no longer just the girl whose mouth was taped shut. She was the girl who made the system speak. Then came the call. A lawyer from New Orleans contacted Jefferson. He represented Denise Whittaker, the former teacher who started it all. She was ready to testify before Congress. In a stunning twist, Whittaker had been compiling her own files, emails, recordings, personal notes, going back almost a decade. What Jefferson thought was a single cracked wall turned out to be the tip of a buried foundation. She claimed there had been racial management philosophies taught in teacher certification programs across the South. She gave them names, institutions, specific sessions. She admitted that many of the educators who used silent compliance tools had no idea they were perpetuating systemic racism. They thought they were following best practices. Jefferson sat with her in a closed-door meeting. "Why are you really doing this now?" he asked her. She didn't blink. "Because if I had a daughter like Malia, I'd want someone to tell the truth." Years later, they'd write about it in books. Documentaries would trace the courtroom battle that launched a movement. Universities would create ethics courses around the Jefferson vs. Ascension Parish case. And Malia? At 18, she'd get accepted into Howard University on a full ride. In her admissions essay, she wrote, "Justice doesn't always start with a bang. Sometimes it starts with the sound of tape being peeled from your lips." And Darius Jefferson? He still kept the piece of tape from that day, not as a symbol of what was done, but as a reminder that even when they try to silence you, truth speaks louder. The story should have ended with the courtroom victory, the national headlines, the legislation, the redemption arc of the disgraced teacher turned whistleblower. But in the real world, when you kick over a stone, you don't just find bugs, you find tunnels. 3 months after Whittaker's testimony before Congress, a retired federal education consultant named Alvin Marks reached out to Darius Jefferson. He was 78, sharp, and carried the weary eyes of someone who'd watched a system rot from the inside for too long. In the 90s, he'd worked for a task force that tried and failed to reform how schools across the South trained teachers to handle at-risk students. Marks asked Jefferson to meet him in a diner outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Over black coffee and a folder full of yellowed memos, he dropped a bomb. "What happened to your daughter?" Mark said. "Wasn't new. The blueprint for that kind of discipline has been floating around since 1979. Jefferson leaned in. "You're saying this was institutionalized?" "I'm saying it was by design." The file Marks gave him was a mix of old training pamphlets, newsletters, and workshop schedules from a long-defunct education initiative called Project Quiet Minds. Funded through a patchwork of grants and quietly backed by former federal officials, it was created after the buzzing wars of the 70s. Its stated goal: classroom stability through controlled communication. Its real purpose? Silencing black students, especially those who challenged authority with words, not violence. One slide said it clearly: control the voice, control the room. The philosophy was subtle. It didn't promote hitting, yelling, or punishment. It promoted silence as control. Praise quiet students, penalize loud ones, redefine talking too much as a threat, and most of all, never let them control the conversation. Marks said the program was disbanded officially in 1987, but its materials, its mindset, were quietly passed along through teacher mentorship programs, repackaged into behavioral tools, and spread through small-town school systems like whispered scripture. And it hadn't just stayed in the South. Jefferson was stunned. He realized something bone deep. Malia's case was never just about one teacher. It wasn't even just about one district. It was a living ghost, a racist educational ideology dressed in academic language, still breathing through people who didn't even know its name. By now, the DOJ was involved. Multiple lawsuits were being prepared in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. But then Jefferson got a leak from an unexpected source: his own client list. A junior staffer at the Louisiana Department of Education reached out anonymously. She'd discovered that during Malia's case, emails had been deleted. Specifically, internal communications between Ascension Parish school officials and members of the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, BESE. Even more explosive, one of the board members had actively worked to suppress the investigation. That board member, Conrad LaGrange, a respected education advisor, former high school principal, frequent guest on local news, and the man who'd publicly condemned the media hysteria around Malia's case. Jefferson subpoenaed his personal device records. What he found: dozens of deleted texts, coordinating messaging, pressuring reporters, and warning allies. Don't let the Malia thing go too far. If this cracks open, it's not just Ascension. We're all exposed. It was clear now. The silence wasn't just in the classrooms, it was in the boardrooms. The scandal reached a fever pitch when the New York Times published a front-page expose titled "How American Schools Silenced Black Voices and Who Helped Them Do It." The story traced Project Quiet Minds, tracked its legacy through school systems, and connected it to the modern compliance protocols used across the South. Congress called for hearings. State boards were purged. 3 universities shut down education workshops linked to the old doctrine, and in the middle of it all was Malia. Now 14, she wasn't just a symbol, she was becoming a force. She published an op-ed in Teen Vogue, delivered a keynote at the National Education Equity Summit, and was nominated for a National Youth Leadership Award. And at every appearance, she said the same thing. You didn't just try to silence me. You tried to erase a whole way of being black out loud, and we're not going anywhere. Just when it felt like the last stone had been turned over, another twist landed. A former school board secretary, long retired, contacted Jefferson's team. She said she kept a recording from a closed-door 2006 meeting in Baton Rouge. She never planned to use it, but after seeing Malia speak, she changed her mind. Jefferson played the tape. The voices were scratchy, but unmistakable. We've got to control classroom chaos. These girls, they grow up thinking their voice is the same as authority. If we don't train them early to listen, not argue, they'll run over us. So use what works, tape, if you have to. They laughed, and in that moment, the entire case, the entire movement, was sealed in history. It was never about discipline, it was about power. It had been nearly 2 years since that first strip of tape was peeled from Malia Jefferson's lips. The world had changed, or at least parts of it had. But as Darius Jefferson stood alone in the hallway of his home, looking out over the front yard, the quiet street, the rustling oaks, the black SUV parked 2 houses down, he realized something. The more truth you uncover, the darker the shadows get. Because now it wasn't just angry school board members or anonymous hate mail. Now there were threats, not from rednecks waving Confederate flags, from people in suits, people with ties to old Southern money, nonprofit foundations, and education reform firms with federal contracts. They weren't trying to scare him off the case. They were trying to erase the case entirely. The threats began quietly. A call to one of Jefferson's associates in Atlanta: "Drop the case. She's just one girl. Don't burn your firm for her." Then came the audit notices. His foundation's books, squeaky clean, suddenly flagged for irregularities. Then a break-in at his office. Only one thing stolen: a flash drive containing confidential testimony from 3 whistleblowers set to testify in a new civil rights suit in South Carolina. This wasn't local anymore. This was coordinated. And then came the biggest shock of all. Judge Nadine Carter, the presiding judge over the upcoming federal case connected to the Project Quiet Minds network, failed to appear in court. Missing. 3 days. No contact. No statement. Rumors flew. She was pressured to recuse. She'd been offered a private position by a politically connected firm, or worse, she'd been forced into hiding. A week later, her resignation appeared in the system. No explanation. Just one line in the docket: "Due to personal safety concerns, I will be stepping away from all active cases indefinitely." Jefferson read it twice. The machine wasn't just protecting itself. It was scrubbing the battlefield. The pressure was no longer just public. Inside the Jefferson home, the toll of 2 years in the spotlight began to wear down the edges of peace. Malia, now in her freshman year of high school, had become famous. Not in the glamorous way, in the dangerous way. One teacher whispered about her in class. A student's parent filed a complaint that she was inciting tension. On TikTok, her name trended under a cruel hashtag, #Mothy Malia. She started eating lunch alone again. She told her father over dinner one night, voice cracking, "Maybe I should have just let her tape me." Darius put down his fork. "You don't get to say that, baby girl. You changed the damn world." "Yeah, but I lost mine in the process." He didn't have a comeback for that. It was Darius's father, Robert Jefferson Sr., a retired Baptist pastor, who reminded them where the fight really started. He'd seen this before, in Montgomery, in Selma, in Baton Rouge. "Son, when you start scraping at the bones of racism, don't act surprised when ghosts rise up to bury you in them." He handed Darius a dusty file from the family's archives, church documents from the 1960s, where he'd once counseled families whose children had been disciplined out of all-white schools. One case stood out. A girl named Amelia Frost. Black. Brilliant. Expelled at 13 for talking out of turn. Her photo looked eerily like Malia. "She disappeared after that," Robert said. "Moved north. Voice gone. Future gone. No one ever asked what happened to her. No one remembered." Darius stared at the picture. This wasn't just his daughter's story. It was a cycle, one that had swallowed generations of black girls who dared to speak, dared to learn, dared to push back. And now, it was his job to end it. With new backing from pro bono legal teams and donations flooding in, Jefferson turned his eye toward a far bigger battlefield, the Midwest. Reports from schools in Ohio, Indiana, and even Illinois showed a rise in silent compliance tactics, especially toward black and brown girls in charter school systems. What made it worse? They were calling it progressive discipline. One case showed a 12-year-old girl duct taped to her chair in a Detroit prep academy because she refused to stop asking questions. The term used by the instructor? Verbal aggression. Jefferson launched a national tour, visiting city after city, speaking to parents, lawmakers, clergy, and each time he showed one image, the piece of tape. "This is your curriculum," he told them. "This is the real Common Core. Control the voice, then control the mind, then bury the truth." And slowly, he wasn't alone anymore. As the movement grew, so did the pushback. Right-wing media painted Malia as an activist pawn. Conservative passees ran ads accusing Jefferson of turning schools into courtrooms. A leaked memo from a charter school lobby group said, "If we lose control of the narrative, we lose the funding. Kill this story, or it kills us." And just when it seemed like the pressure might finally snap the Jefferson family apart, another whistleblower stepped forward, a federal education contractor who had worked on data analysis for school behavioral interventions. She had emails, recordings, and the original playbook, a scanned PDF titled "Managing Disruptive Culture in Early Youth, a Strategy Guide for Urban Classrooms." Page 1 quote. "Some children are born into environments of volume. To educate them, we must first teach them silence." It had been distributed to over 7,000 educators. The storm was only beginning. 2 years and 7 months after the original incident in Baton Rouge, Darius Jefferson's name was now whispered in federal circles, legal think tanks, and evening news programs. He'd become a symbol, a black man with iron in his voice and the Constitution in his hands, chasing justice in a way that made politicians nervous. That made voters listen. So, when he got the call, he wasn't surprised. It came from Senator Lagon T. Brandt, a moderate Democrat with presidential ambitions and a reputation for building bridges. Brandt asked him to fly to D.C. In a private office inside the Capitol, Brandt made the offer. "I want you to run for office, Darius. Congress, Louisiana's 6th. We'll back you. National spotlight, national stage." Jefferson didn't answer right away. not because he didn't want to, because he'd seen what power cost. Back home, Malia had just turned 15. She was scheduled to deliver a speech at a national education summit in Chicago. But when the car pulled up to the venue, protesters were already outside, not from white supremacist groups, from teachers' unions. Signs read, "Stop weaponizing students." She's not a hero. She's a tool. Real teachers, real struggle. Inside, Malia froze. These were supposed to be the good guys. And now they were turning on her. She delivered the speech. But that night, she broke down in the hotel room. "Dad, what if they're right? What if I'm just a thing now, not a person?" Darius sat beside her and said something he hadn't said in a long time. Being right doesn't protect you, but it makes what you go through mean something. That night, he decided to take the meeting with Brant again. The moment word leaked that Jefferson might run for Congress, the machine shifted gears. A PAC called Families for Free Education released an attack ad. "Darius Jefferson wants to turn your schools into courtrooms and your children into lawsuits." Another hit piece dug into his past. A college protest from the 90s, twisted into an accusation of radical activism. And then there was Gregory Harlan, a polished black conservative lawyer funded by dark money, who announced his own run for the 6th District. Harlan's message was simple. "I believe in discipline, in structure, in quiet classrooms and real results, not lawsuits, not chaos." The message hit, especially with suburban moderates, and worse, with some black voters who remembered the old ways, who thought Malia's story was painful, yes, but didn't justify dismantling the system. One radio caller said, "I grew up getting paddled in school. You know what? I turned out fine." The tide was starting to shift. Weeks before the campaign decision deadline, Jefferson was visited by two men, former federal attorneys turned lobbyists. They weren't there to threaten. They were there to bargain. "Drop the congressional run. We'll fund the Malia Foundation for the next 10 years. $12 million. No strings. Just walk away from the spotlight." It was clean, respectful, even tempting. But there was one string. They wanted the Jeffersons to sign an NDA. No more cases, no more public speeches, no more fire. Darius took the offer to his wife, Tasha, the quiet backbone of the family. She looked him in the eyes and said, "You already taught her to fight. What will it teach her if you back down now?" So the answer was no. The first debate between Jefferson and Harlan was televised across the state. It was supposed to be about education, but it turned into a war over identity, silence, and who gets to define black progress in America. At one point, Harlan leaned forward and said, "Your daughter was disruptive. That's not racism. That's discipline." The room went still. Jefferson smiled. "My daughter asked a question. That's not disruption. That's education." It was the moment that flipped the room and the polls. Then came the twist no one expected. Remember Amelia Frost? The black girl expelled in 1964 for speaking too loudly in class, the one whose file Darius's father had kept? A journalist dug up the name. She was alive, 74 years old, living in New York, a retired librarian, no family, no voice ever heard again in any public forum. Jefferson brought her to Baton Rouge. Malia met her. They stood together on a stage in front of 5,000 people. "They stole her future," Malia said, voice steady, "and they tried to steal mine, but they didn't, because now she gets to speak and I get to keep speaking." It broke every firewall. Suddenly, even the most hardened voters remembered. They remembered the tapes. They remembered the girls they'd watched disappear into silence. They remembered what happened when nobody said anything. 1 week after the rally with Amelia Frost, the Jeffersons lost someone. Robert Jefferson Sr., Darius's father, the old pastor who had marched with King, who kept the story alive all these years, passed away in his sleep. Massive heart attack. No warning. He was 88. The funeral was held in Baton Rouge at the small brick church he had pastored for over 40 years. The pews were filled not just with mourners, but with generations, former students, civil rights veterans, and young activists who'd never met him, but knew his legacy. In his eulogy, Darius said, "My father believed in a God who hears the cries of the unheard. He taught me that silence isn't golden when it's used to bury the truth." Afterward, an old man approached Darius outside the church, weathered face, cane in hand, voice like gravel. "Your daddy helped hide me from state troopers in '66. I was 17. He never told nobody, just fed me, gave me shelter, and prayed over me. You got his fire. But this thing you're fighting, it's bigger than police dogs and fire hoses. It wears suits now, and it smiles while it kills." Darius nodded. He already knew. 3 days after the funeral, a manila envelope showed up on the porch of the Jefferson home. No return address, just one word handwritten on the back: insurance. Inside were hundreds of pages, leaked internal communications between school administrators, legal consultants, and private education firms. It outlined a strategy, codename Quiet Corridor. Its purpose? To reduce classroom volatility by identifying high-risk students using behavioral analytics and AI surveillance software, most of it deployed without parental consent. But here's the kicker. Over 78% of flagged students were black girls. Malia's name was on one of the original trial lists, not because she had a record, but because the algorithm flagged excessive verbal frequency and interruptive curiosity as markers for potential disruption. It wasn't a teacher's decision. It was data-driven racism, a silent system designed to filter, mute, and erase. Darius had seen it before, in courtrooms, in jails, in red-lined mortgage maps. But now, it was in the classroom. Jefferson brought the documents to a longtime ally, Ethan Rawlins, a fellow civil rights attorney and co-founder of the Justice Roots Initiative, someone Darius trusted for years. Together, they planned to go public, until Rawlins disappeared for 48 hours. When he returned, he looked different, nervous, sweaty, quiet. Then he called off the press conference. "You don't understand, Darius. If this leaks the wrong way, it won't just take down charter schools. It'll hit state pensions, corporate donors, national campaigns. So, this movement dies in court. But if you run for Congress, you can change it from inside." Rawlins had flipped. They got to him. Money, fear, blackmail, didn't matter. The line had been crossed. Darius had a decision to make: run for office or release the files now and risk it all. He chose to release. The leak went viral. CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times. Even conservative outlets couldn't ignore the story. Algorithmic discipline, the hidden war against black girls. Lawsuits were filed in 6 states. The Department of Education opened a federal review. Parents came forward, more whistleblowers. And then, the arrest of Dr. Melinda Dorsey, a chief executive at CoreMind Analytics, the company behind the behavior tracking system, charged with falsifying testing protocols and withholding failure data from the Department of Education. The movement was winning, but victory wasn't cheap. Malia began getting death threats. Darius received an envelope filled with white powder. It was cornstarch, still terrifying. Tasha Jefferson was followed from the grocery store twice. At a press event in Shreveport, a man lunged at Darius screaming, "You're destroying our schools!" Security tackled him, and the media turned again. Is Jefferson inciting division? Are black families being used as political pawns? Polls began to dip. Even supporters were afraid. And then, on a quiet Thursday night, as Darius and Tasha sat outside on their porch, drinking coffee in silence, Malia walked out barefoot, holding her phone, her voice calm, too calm. Someone made a fake Instagram account with my name. They're saying I lied about the tape, that I made it up. And people believe it. Her hands were shaking. Am I a fraud? Darius stood up, walked over, and took the phone from her hand. You are not a fraud. You are a mirror, and people don't like what they see in it. It was Election Day. The 6th Congressional District of Louisiana, a district long known for its deep political divides, was about to make history. At the heart of it was Darius Jefferson, a lawyer who had once sat quietly in the background, taking on civil rights cases here and there, had become a symbol for a generation of activists fighting against an unseen, pervasive system of oppression. But victory was anything but certain. His opponent, Gregory Harlan, had honed his message. He presented himself as the safe candidate. Harlan had won the hearts of the rural conservative voters with his promises to restore order and discipline in schools. His slogan was simple: make schools safe, make America safe. But the reality was much darker. The very programs that Harlan championed, systems built on surveillance, behavioral control, and subdued voices, had disproportionately harmed the very people Darius had vowed to fight for: black and brown children. And it was that reality that Jefferson had spent the last several months risking his life and reputation trying to expose. Yet, as the polls tightened, whispers began to circulate that there were forces at play beyond just the typical campaign. There were rumors of voter suppression, long lines at black precincts, ballots inexplicably missing, voting machines malfunctioning, too many people missing from the rolls. Some of it was subtle, shifts in the system that didn't make the news but were enough to raise alarm. The Bureau of Investigation had been tipped off by local activists, but the whispers were growing louder. An anonymous letter appeared on Jefferson's doorstep a week before the election. If you push too hard, they'll show you just how much power they have. Think of your daughter. Think of your wife. Think of how easy it is for them to make people disappear. Darius had seen the lengths the system would go to in order to preserve itself. The night before the election, Tasha pulled Darius aside in the kitchen. Do you ever wonder what happens if we lose Darius? All of it? The money, the media, the support? What do we do when they turn on us? We keep fighting, but there are moments when the battle gets won in the silence, when the truth can't be suppressed anymore, and we hold on to that. Her eyes met his. They both knew they were up against more than just a man in a suit. The results came in slowly. The night stretched on, each precinct reporting with that uncomfortable delayed tension. Darius was up against something more insidious than just political opposition. The black community had come out in droves to support him, but Harlan's camp, backed by powerful donors from outside the district, had enough muscle to keep things in check. The turnout wasn't as high as expected in the neighborhoods Darius had fought hardest for. Midnight. Darius paced the room, his stomach in knots. He glanced at Malia, who was on her phone, reading the reports from social media. She had become the symbol of the campaign, but also its most vulnerable target. They both knew the cost of this, the threat of erasure. Then the announcement came. It was too close to call, too many questionable ballots, too many broken voting machines in the black districts. It wasn't clear if they had won, but what became clear was that the fight was far from over. Darius stepped up to the podium for his concession speech, knowing the game wasn't finished. The room was packed with family, friends, and supporters, but the faces were a mix of fear and resolve. He took a deep breath. Tonight, we are facing a system that does not want us to speak, a system that does not want us to be seen, and that is why we will continue. Because the truth doesn't just stay silent, it echoes. He paused, letting the silence hang thick in the air. I didn't run for office because I wanted power. I ran because our children, our black girls, deserve to have their voices heard. We can't stop. The fight isn't over, and when we come together again, we will be louder than ever. The next day, the headlines blared. Jefferson concedes. Harlan declared winner, but questions remain about election integrity. The media outlets, of course, framed it as a close call, a noble effort by the Jefferson campaign that ultimately fell short. But there were other whispers that wouldn't go away. There was talk that the Department of Justice would be investigating the allegations of voter suppression. Talk of a federal review into the Quiet Corridor program. The systems that had been put in place to track and subjugate black students were finally, publicly, being called into question. The story had gone from a small-town scandal to a national reckoning, and in the shadows, power brokers from both sides, who thought they'd silence the issue, were now on defensive. 3 weeks after the election, an unexpected ally reached out. Senator Lagon T. Brandt, the same politician who had tried to persuade Darius to run for Congress in the first place. Brandt's voice on the phone was calm but urgent. Darius, I'm not calling to rehash the election, but we're seeing the early signs of a backlash. And not just from your side. I've had a series of conversations with some allies in the Senate and the House. We can't let this go. We need you more than ever. Darius rubbed his temples. We lost. It's over. The fight is over, but the movement you started, the power you've woken up, that's just the beginning. Brandt continued, there's an opportunity to introduce real legislative change at the federal level, to shut down the programs that allowed this to happen. But it will take someone like you, someone who's lived it, fought it, and isn't afraid to stand up. Darius looked over at Malia, who was sitting at the kitchen table, a laptop open in front of her. She'd become a young activist in her own right. Darius could see the fire in her, just like he had seen it in his father. Then his mind wandered to the family's future, to the risks, to the fight. And yet, he realized something. Even though he had lost the election, the battle for his daughter's generation wasn't over. There was no going back. The fight to dismantle systems of oppression in schools, the fight for black voices, black girls, and the truth about what had been stolen from them, that would continue. But this time, it would be different. Darius wasn't going to run for office. at least not as a traditional candidate. Instead, he was going to build something that couldn't be destroyed, a movement, a coalition, a legacy. The air was thick with uncertainty the day Darius Jefferson made his final stand. The dust had barely settled from the election debacle, but the cracks in the system had begun to widen, and now it was time for the country to truly see what had been at stake all along. It wasn't just about an election. It wasn't about the power or the career that came with the title of congressman. It was about something deeper, the right to be seen, the right to speak, the right to exist without fear of erasure. After the election, Darius had been flooded with requests. Some were from old allies, others were from new voices, voices that had been waiting for the right moment to rise, to speak out, to fight. Darius knew he was now more than just a candidate. He was a symbol, the embodiment of an entire community that had been silenced for too long. But even as the world watched, there was an unexpected force moving behind the scenes, a force far more insidious than he could have ever imagined. One afternoon, while he was meeting with his team to plan his next move, an envelope arrived, hand-delivered by an unmarked van. Inside was a letter and a photo. The letter was short, but chilling. "This is only the beginning. You think you won by exposing the truth? Wait until you see what happens when you're in the fight alone. You've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Watch your back." The photo showed Malia alone at the park, laughing with friends. But there was something unsettling about it. Someone was standing in the background, almost invisible. Darius's hands trembled as he held the letter. The stakes had become personal. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about family, safety, and the future. It took a moment for him to calm himself, but then he knew what needed to be done. The fight was not over. If anything, this was the moment where they would take the fight to the next level. The next morning, Darius and Malia stood before the cameras at the Malia Foundation press conference, the very foundation Darius had started in her name after the incident in the classroom. Darius spoke first, his voice steady but raw with emotion. "We've been silenced before. We've been overlooked, ignored, and pushed aside. But here's the truth. No one can silence the truth forever." Malia joined him at the podium, her voice clear, carrying the weight of everything she had gone through and everything she was now fighting for. "This is not just about me. This is about every single student, every single black girl who has ever been told they were too loud, too much, too disruptive. This is about the right to speak up, the right to take up space, the right to be heard." Together, they announced a nationwide movement, Voices Unbroken. It was time to challenge the very systems that were built to keep their voices down. They would demand reforms. They would demand that every child, regardless of race, background, or socioeconomic status, had the right to an education free from surveillance, free from discrimination, and free from the fear of being erased. This wasn't just a fight for Malia anymore. This was for every student across the nation who had been dismissed, ignored, or silenced. As the press conference concluded, it was clear that this wasn't just a one-time story. It wasn't a flash-in-the-pan movement that would fade out in a few weeks. This was a shift in the cultural fabric. People began speaking up. Parents from across the country began sharing their own stories, stories about their children who had been pushed aside by systems built to fail them. Legislators, both allies and adversaries, began paying attention. The Department of Education officially launched an investigation into the Quiet Corridor program, and there were calls from all sides of the aisle for more oversight on the growing trend of behavioral analytics in schools. In the months that followed, the Jeffersons continued their battle. They traveled across the country, speaking in schools, holding town halls, and attending rallies. They stood alongside teachers who fought against data-driven discipline, and with parents who fought against the systemic racism that had been embedded in education for far too long. But the threats remained. The letters, the stares, the shadowy figures who watched from afar. They knew that their fight would come at a price. But Darius and Malia were ready. They knew they couldn't back down, and so the Jefferson family's journey was far from over. What began as a simple act of resistance, a father standing up for his daughter, turned into a powerful national movement, a clarion call to speak truth to power. In the end, the message was clear. The system will always try to silence the truth, but truth, once spoken, cannot be erased. For every person who has ever been dismissed because of their race, gender, or voice, this story is a reminder that we are never too small to make a difference, that our voices matter, and when we unite and speak truth together, we can change the world around us. If you've been moved by this story, if it's touched you in a way that you can't quite shake, or if you've found yourself caring deeply about one of these characters, whether it's Darius, Malia, or someone else, share your thoughts and impressions in the comments. We want to hear your voice too. What do you think? And remember, this is just the beginning. There are so many more stories like this to come. Stories that need to be heard. Stories that will make you think, challenge your perceptions, and inspire change. Subscribe and follow our stories because the fight for truth, justice, and freedom is one that never ends.